There is one city on earth that seems to carry a weight far beyond politics. A city no larger than many modern capitals. A city fought over for thousands of years. A city that has outlived empires, survived invasions, witnessed the rise and fall of kings, and remained at the center of global tension, unlike any other place on the planet. That city is Jerusalem. And according to biblical prophecy, there is one future event involving Jerusalem so serious, so consequential, that when it finally happens, it may signal the beginning of events that cannot be reversed. Not a minor political development, not another ordinary diplomatic dispute, but something far bigger, something Scripture describes with extraordinary seriousness, the division of Jerusalem. And if that moment ever becomes reality, the consequences may be unlike anything this generation is prepared for, because Jerusalem is not simply a city in biblical thought. It is symbolic, strategic, prophetic. It is mentioned hundreds of times in Scripture. It is called the city of the great King. It is tied to covenant, identity, worship, prophecy, and ultimately the return of Christ. This is why Jerusalem has never been merely geographical. It is spiritual territory. And throughout history, what happens to Jerusalem has rarely stayed local. Its conflicts ripple outward. Its status influences nations. Its future is deeply embedded into prophetic timelines, which raises an unsettling question. Why does the Bible place such enormous emphasis on the fate of this one city? The answer may be found in one of the most sobering warnings in prophetic scripture. Joel 3:2 says, "I will gather all nations, and will enter into judgment with them there concerning my people and my heritage Israel, because they have divided up my land." Read that again carefully. Not merely conflict over land, not merely disagreement, division. The dividing of the land is treated not as a neutral geopolitical negotiation, but as something carrying spiritual consequence. And for many prophecy watchers, that changes everything. Because Jerusalem has long been one of the most contested issues in international diplomacy. Again and again proposals emerge, peace plans, territorial negotiations, international pressure, two-state discussions, shared sovereignty concepts, redefinitions of borders, all orbiting the same question: who controls Jerusalem, who governs it, who claims it, and perhaps most critically, can it be divided? To many observers, this is merely political complexity. But to those who study biblical prophecy, it is far more than that. It may represent a prophetic trigger point, a line with consequences attached. And what makes this topic especially intense is that global pressure surrounding Jerusalem has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified. The city remains emotionally charged, diplomatically volatile, and symbolically explosive. 3 major world religions hold deep connections to it. Regional powers care about it. Global powers monitor it. International institutions repeatedly address it. And yet, despite endless efforts, Jerusalem remains unresolved. Why? Because some issues are deeper than policy. Some tensions are rooted in identity, history, covenant, and narrative. And according to Scripture, Jerusalem belongs to all those categories simultaneously. This is what makes it unique and perhaps what makes it dangerous. Because when something carries symbolic meaning far beyond itself, decisions surrounding it become magnified. Jerusalem is not simply about territory. It represents competing worldviews, competing histories, competing futures. And this is why every proposal involving Jerusalem carries unusual weight. But prophecy suggests something even more unsettling. Not only that Jerusalem will remain central, but that it will become increasingly burdensome to the nations. Zechariah 12:3 says, "I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all peoples." Think about that image. A burdensome stone, something heavy, difficult to move, dangerous to mishandle, capable of injuring those who attempt to control it improperly. And that metaphor feels strikingly relevant. Because nation after nation has attempted to solve the Jerusalem question, yet resolution remains elusive. Deals collapse, negotiations stall, tensions resurface, violence reignites. Why does this city resist simplification so powerfully? Scripture suggests the answer is not accidental. Jerusalem is not merely historically important, it is prophetically loaded. And that means future developments involving the city may carry implications far beyond diplomacy. This is where many people become uncomfortable. Because it is one thing to discuss prophecy abstractly, it is another to consider that real geopolitical decisions happening in modern history may intersect with ancient warnings. That possibility changes how one interprets headlines, not with hysteria, but with heightened attention. Because the Bible does not describe Jerusalem fading into irrelevance, quite the opposite. Its centrality increases, its tensions escalate, its significance intensifies, and eventually, according to prophecy, it becomes a focal point of international attention on an unprecedented scale. This is one reason Jesus himself referenced Jerusalem repeatedly in prophetic contexts. He did not treat it as incidental background detail. He treated it as central terrain, and that should cause people to pay attention, because when Scripture repeatedly highlights the same location, pattern recognition matters. Jerusalem is not peripheral, it is recurring, persistent, strategic, and perhaps prophetic in ways still unfolding. But here is what makes the possibility of division so symbolically potent. Division is not simply physical separation, it is fragmentation, partition, redrawing boundaries, restructuring ownership, and in biblical symbolism, boundaries matter. Land is not treated casually in Scripture. Inheritance matters, covenantal geography matters, allocation matters, which is why altering those structures is portrayed as deeply significant. Now, none of this means every diplomatic discussion automatically fulfills prophecy. That would be simplistic. History contains many proposals that never materialized, many tensions that did not culminate in final outcomes, but biblical literacy does suggest something important. Some developments deserve closer observation than others, and Jerusalem is one of them. Always. Which brings us to the deeper question, why would dividing Jerusalem matter so much? Perhaps because Jerusalem represents more than a city. It represents authority, belonging, spiritual legitimacy, and future expectation. Whoever shapes Jerusalem symbolically claims narrative influence. That is why the stakes feel so unusually high, and why global attention repeatedly returns there. This is not random, it is gravitational. Jerusalem pulls history toward itself again and again, and this pattern may intensify, not weaken. This is where prophecy becomes especially sobering, because biblical texts do not describe a future of decreasing tension around Jerusalem. They describe escalation, pressure, convergence, international focus. That should at minimum provoke reflection, not fear, but seriousness. Because if Scripture is correct, then what happens involving Jerusalem is not isolated, it is connected. Connected to broader developments, broader alignments, broader sequences, and sequences matter. Many major events in prophecy are not random standalone incidents. They unfold in patterns, triggers, catalysts, escalations. One development opening pathways for another. This is why some prophecy students pay such close attention to symbolic trigger points, not because every headline is fulfillment, but because some events alter the landscape meaningfully, and a formal movement toward dividing Jerusalem would certainly qualify as meaningful, potentially historic, potentially prophetic, potentially destabilizing. Which returns us to the title of this video. If this happens to Jerusalem, it's over, not necessarily meaning instant apocalypse in a cinematic sense, but perhaps the crossing of a threshold, a movement deeper into a prophetic phase difficult to reverse, a point where symbolic lines become materially crossed, and that possibility should at least encourage vigilance, because history often appears obvious only in retrospect. People living through major turning points rarely recognize them in real time. Not immediately, only later do they realize they were watching inflection points unfold. That may happen again, which is why discernment matters. Not sensationalism. Discernment, watching patterns carefully, studying Scripture responsibly, remaining sober, remaining grounded, remaining attentive. Because prophecy was never given merely to entertain curiosity. It was given to cultivate preparedness, awareness, perspective, and perhaps humility. A reminder that history is not random, that events are not always disconnected, that some places matter more than others in the biblical narrative, and Jerusalem may be chief among them. This is why emotional reactions alone are insufficient. One must move beyond headlines, beyond outrage cycles, beyond simplistic takes, toward deeper understanding, toward context, toward pattern recognition. Because surface analysis often misses structural significance, and Jerusalem is a structurally significant city, arguably unlike any other, which means decisions concerning it deserve unusual attention. Not because every event is final, but because one day one event may be. One decision, one agreement, one restructuring, one formal division. And when that moment comes, many may realize too late why Scripture warned so intensely. That is the unsettling possibility, not certainty on dates, not speculative timelines, but seriousness about patterns, because biblical warnings rarely exist without reason. And repeated warnings about Jerusalem are not accidental. They are deliberate, persistent, strategic. So the question is no longer whether Jerusalem matters. That is already obvious. The real question is this: what happens if the world finally attempts to solve Jerusalem on its own terms? What if the pressure reaches a point where division becomes the preferred global solution? What if what appears to be diplomatic progress is actually prophetic acceleration? That is where the tension lies, because not every solution produces peace. Some produce temporary stability with deeper long-term consequences. And history is full of solutions that solved one problem while creating larger ones beneath the surface. Jerusalem may prove no different, or perhaps even more consequential. Because if prophecy is accurate, Jerusalem is not just another city awaiting political resolution. It is a prophetic fault line, and fault lines do not remain quiet forever. They store pressure until movement comes, suddenly, powerfully, irreversibly, which is why this matters. Not because fear is useful, but because awareness is. Because if this happens to Jerusalem, it may not simply be another diplomatic headline. It may be a signal, a marker, a shift, a development future. Generations will look back on and say, that was the moment everything changed. So watch Jerusalem, not obsessively, but carefully. Because according to Scripture, what happens there may echo far beyond its walls. And if that line is crossed, history may accelerate faster than most people imagine. But here is what makes all of this even more striking. Jerusalem is one of the only cities on earth where ancient prophecy and modern politics seem to collide almost daily. Every statement made about it matters. Every negotiation is scrutinized. Every proposed agreement carries symbolic weight. And perhaps that alone should cause people to ask why this small city continues attracting disproportionate global attention. Why do the nations keep circling back to the same place? Why does this issue refuse to fade? Why has no lasting resolution ever fully emerged? Perhaps because Jerusalem is not simply waiting for a human solution. Perhaps its future was never meant to be resolved purely through diplomacy. This is what makes the city so unique in prophetic discussions. It sits at the intersection of history and expectation, memory and destiny, conflict and promise. And because of that, every serious movement involving its status naturally draws intense attention from those familiar with Scripture. And if that is true, then watching Jerusalem is not merely political curiosity. It is prophetic literacy. It is understanding that some places in Scripture carry a gravity history repeatedly confirms. Jerusalem is one of those places, perhaps the place. And if one day the world finally pushes far enough to divide what Scripture repeatedly emphasizes, the consequences may extend far beyond diplomacy. They may mark the opening of an entirely different chapter, one far more serious than most people are prepared to imagine.